What if the world ended? Not with fire, but with water. Not just some rain, but water everywhere, covering mountains, swallowing everything we know. It's a scary thought, right? And it's a thought people have had for thousands of years. From ancient Mesopotamia to the Americas, from Australia to the islands of the Pacific, stories tell of a time when a great flood washed away almost everything. Think about that. Across continents, separated by vast oceans and impossible distances, people told very similar stories. How did that happen? Was there a single global event? Or did many local floods inspire the same deep fear and wonder? Scholars like James George Fraser, the author of The Golden Bough, looked at these myths and saw a common human experience. Others, like the geologist William Ryan and oceanographer Walter Pittman, who wrote Noah's Flood, the new scientific discoveries about the event that changed history, propose real geological events. They suggest things like the sudden filling of the Black Sea thousands of years ago. It's a compelling idea. But even with science, a lot remains a mystery. Why do these stories resonate so much? Why do they often feature a divine hand, a warning, and a few survivors chosen to restart humanity? We're talking about more than just old tales. We're talking about core beliefs about how people understood their world, their gods, and their own place in the grand scheme of things. These aren't just stories. They're echoes from a very distant past, whispers of a time when the world might have been a very different place. They make you wonder, don't they? About what we've forgotten, about what we still don't truly understand. Number 15. What if the first story was about water? The Mesopotamian flood myth, often called the Epic of Gilgamesh, is probably one of the oldest stories we have. It's written on clay tablets dating back to at least the 18th century BCE. But the story itself is much older. The most complete version comes from the Library of Ashurbanipal, an Assyrian king found in Nineveh in the 19th century. A man named George Smith, working at the British Museum, translated these tablets in 1872. He found a part that sounded incredibly like the biblical story of Noah. It was a huge discovery. People were shocked. It showed that the flood story wasn't just in the Bible. It was part of a much older tradition. The hero of this story isn't Noah, it's Utnapishtim. He's a very old man, made immortal by the gods. Gilgamesh, looking for eternal life, finds Utnapishtim, and Utnapishtim tells him his story. The gods, led by Enlil, got annoyed with humanity. Humans were too noisy, too chaotic, so the gods decided to wipe them out with a flood. But one god, Ea, felt bad. He warned Utnapishtim in a dream. Ea told Utnapishtim to build a huge boat. He gave him very specific instructions: build a ship, tear down your house, give up your possessions, save life. That Utnapishtim had to load all kinds of animals, wild and tame, into the boat. He also brought his family and craftsmen. Then the storm came. It was terrifying. Rain, thunder, lightning for 6 days and 6 nights. Even the gods were scared. Ishtar, the goddess, cried out, regretting their decision. On the 7th day, the flood stopped. Utnapishtim looked out. All of humanity was gone. He wept. His boat landed on a mountain, Mount Nimush. He waited 7 days, then he sent out a dove, it came back. He sent a swallow, it came back. Finally, he sent a raven, it flew off and didn't return. That meant the water had receded enough. Utnapishtim and his family left the ark. He offered a sacrifice to the gods. The gods smelled the sweet aroma. Enlil, the one who started it all, was angry that someone had survived. But Ea stood up to him. Ea argued that punishing all of humanity was wrong. Maybe a plague, or wild animals, but not total annihilation. So Enlil changed his mind. He blessed Utnapishtim and his wife, granting them immortality and placing them far away. This story is incredibly important. It shows how ancient people wrestled with questions of divine power, human responsibility, and the fragility of life. Archaeologists have found evidence of massive local floods in Mesopotamia. Leonard Woolley, for example, found a thick layer of clean clay in Ur in the 1920s, suggesting a huge flood around 4,000 to 3,500 BCE. Other sites like Shuruppak also show similar flood layers. These were probably local events, but they were catastrophic enough to be remembered for generations. And they might have been the spark for this enduring story, the idea of a divine will controlling nature and humanity's place within that. It's all there in those old clay tablets. Did a truly cataclysmic regional flood really happen in Mesopotamia? So profound it became the template for countless other myths. What specific geological event, if any, could have been so devastating and widespread enough to inspire such a detailed account, preserved for millennia? And how much of the story is historical memory versus human interpretation of natural disaster? Number 14, is there one true story or many true stories? The Hebrew flood narrative, found in the book of Genesis, is perhaps the most famous flood story in the world. It tells of Noah, a righteous man in a wicked world. This story has shaped Western culture for centuries. It's part of the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The details are familiar to many. God sees the great wickedness of humanity. People's thoughts were only evil all the time. God felt regret for making humans. He decided to destroy all life on earth with a flood. But Noah found favor in God's eyes. God told Noah to build an ark. It was to be a massive vessel 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. That's a huge boat, maybe 450 feet long. God gave Noah very precise instructions on how to build it and what to put in it. Noah was to bring his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. And he was to bring 2 of every kind of animal, male and female, into the ark. For clean animals and birds, he was to bring 7 pairs. He was also to gather all kinds of food for them. Noah did everything exactly as God commanded him. Then, when Noah was 600 years old, the flood began. The Bible describes it as the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rose, covering the highest mountains. Everything on earth that had the breath of life died. Only Noah and those with him in the ark survived. The ark floated on the waters for 150 days. Then God remembered Noah. The waters began to recede. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. After another 40 days, Noah sent out a raven. It flew back and forth. Then he sent out a dove. It returned because it found no place to rest. 7 days later, he sent the dove again. This time it came back with a fresh olive leaf. That was a sign that the waters were going down. Another 7 days, and he sent the dove again. This time it did not return. The land was dry. Noah, his family, and all the animals left the ark. Noah built an altar and offered sacrifices to God. God was pleased. God made a covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy all life with a flood. The rainbow became the sign of this covenant. There's been a lot of discussion about the historicity of this event. Creationist groups have launched expeditions to find the ark on Mount Ararat, though no conclusive evidence has ever been found. The scholars, like John Walton, in ancient Near Eastern thought and the Old Testament, discuss how the biblical narrative shares themes and elements with other ancient Near Eastern flood stories, but also presents unique theological messages. It highlights God's justice and mercy and the idea of a fresh start for humanity. The specific details, like the number of days or the dimensions of the ark, are often debated, but the core message about divine intervention in human survival remains powerful. If the biblical flood was truly global, where did all that water go? What geological evidence should we expect to find for such an event, and why is it seemingly absent? And how can we reconcile a literal interpretation of this story with scientific understanding of Earth's history? Number 13. How do new worlds begin from old ones? The Greek flood myth centers around Deucalion and Pyrrha. This story comes from ancient texts like Ovid's Metamorphoses and Apollodorus' Bibliotheca. It's a foundational myth for the Greeks, explaining how humanity was restarted after a terrible catastrophe. Unlike the Mesopotamian and Hebrew versions, which often involve specific boats, the Greek version has some unique twists. Zeus, the king of the gods, grew angry with humanity. People had become incredibly wicked, especially during the Bronze Age. The story of Lycaon is often told alongside this. Lycaon, a king, tried to trick Zeus into eating human flesh, testing his omniscience. This act of impiety sealed humanity's fate. Zeus decided to destroy everyone with a great flood. But Prometheus, the titan who created humans and often looked out for them, warned his son Deucalion. Deucalion was a king in Thessaly, known for his piety and righteousness. Prometheus told him to build a chest or an ark. Deucalion did this, and he and his wife, Pyrrha, daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora, got into it. The flood came. Zeus sent torrential rain, rivers overflowed, the sea covered the land. All of Greece was submerged. All people perished, except Deucalion and Pyrrha, who floated in their wooden chest for 9 days and 9 nights. Eventually, their chests landed on Mount Parnassus, or sometimes Mount Othrys. When the waters receded, Deucalion and Pyrrha were the only humans left. They were lonely. They prayed to the goddess Themis, or sometimes Zeus, for guidance on how to repopulate the earth. Themis told them to throw the bones of your great mother over your shoulders. Deucalion was confused at first, but Pyrrha understood. Their great mother was earth, and her bones were rocks. So they picked up stones and threw them behind their backs. The stones thrown by Deucalion turned into men. The stones thrown by Pyrrha turned into women. This is how the new race of humans, hard and resilient like stone, began. This myth also explains the etymology of the Greek word Laos people, which sounds similar to Las stone. This myth, collected and preserved by writers like Apollodorus in his Bibliotheca, shows the cyclical nature of destruction and creation in Greek thought. It emphasizes divine justice and the rebirth of civilization through a chosen few. Geologically, Greece is an earthquake-prone region with volcanic activity and tsunamis. Historian J.G. Perrott, in his work on Near Eastern archaeology, has explored the possibility of local flooding events influencing these stories. A major tsunami in the Aegean Sea, perhaps following a volcanic eruption, could have been a regional catastrophe severe enough to inspire such a tale. Why do so many ancient cultures associate human wickedness with divine punishment by flood? What does the Greek idea of humans being born from stones tell us about their view of human nature compared to other traditions? And did the survivors of a real localized event truly believe they were the last two people on Earth? Number 12. Can wisdom save us from the inevitable? In Hindu mythology, the story of the Great Flood often features Manu, the progenitor of humanity, and the god Vishnu in his Matsya fish avatar. This myth is found in several ancient texts, including the Shatapatha Brahmana, dating back to around the 6th-8th century BCE, and later elaborated in the Mahabharata and the Puranas. It highlights divine protection and the importance of dharma-righteous conduct. The story begins with Manu, a virtuous sage. One day, while performing his ablutions in a river, a tiny fish swam into his hands and pleaded for protection. Manu, known for his compassion, put the fish in a jar. The fish quickly grew too large for the jar. Manu moved it to a pond, then a lake, then the Ganges River, and finally to the ocean. This fish was no ordinary creature. It was Matsya, an incarnation of the god Vishnu. Matsya revealed his true identity to Manu and warned him of an impending flood that would destroy all life. He instructed Manu to build a large boat. Manu was to gather the seeds of all plants, one of every kind of animal, and the 7 great sages Saptarishis with their wives. When the flood came, the waters rose dramatically. The great fish Matsya appeared again with a horn on its head. Manu fastened his boat to the horn of the fish using a great serpent, Vasuki, as a rope. Matsya then guided the boat safely through the turbulent waters for many years. It pulled the boat to the highest peak in the Himalayas, known as Manu's Boat Peak or Nabadhana. When the flood subsided, Matsya revealed the knowledge of creation to Manu. Manu then performed austerities and sacrifices. From his offerings, a woman named Ida was born. With her, Manu repopulated the earth. This story emphasizes the cyclical nature of time in Hindu cosmology, with periods of creation, preservation, and destruction. The scholar A.L. Basham, in The Wonder That Was India, discusses how this myth is deeply embedded in the Hindu worldview, symbolizing the preservation of knowledge and the continuity of life through divine intervention. The concept of an avatar, a divine descent to earth, is central here. The number of fish stories in different cultures is quite striking, showing the ocean's influence on ancient minds. Geological studies of the Himalayan region do not suggest a single continent-wide flood that would fit the myth's scale. However, major glacial lake outburst floods or a series of significant river floods over millennia could have been events that shaped such narratives. Why is the preserver god, Vishnu, central to this destructive event in Hindu myth, unlike the angry deities in other traditions? What specific events in the Indian subcontinent might have given rise to the image of a giant fish guiding a boat to the Himalayas? And how does the Hindu concept of cyclical time change our understanding of the end of the world compared to linear timelines? Number 11. Does every beginning need an end? The Aztec flood myth, found in various codices and recorded by early Spanish chroniclers like Bernardino de Sahagún in his General History of the Things of New Spain, Florentine Codex in the 16th century, is part of a larger cosmology of successive ages or suns. The current age is the fifth sun, but before it there were previous worlds, each ending in a catastrophe. The flood myth concerns the fourth sun, known as Nahui Atel, or four water. During the age of four water, the world was inhabited by people who had become disobedient and wicked. The gods, particularly Tezcatlipoca, were displeased with humanity, so they sent a massive flood to cleanse the earth. It rained incessantly, and the waters rose for 52 years. The mountains disappeared, and the entire world was submerged. Only one man and his wife, Cox Cox and Joki Quetzal, or sometimes just Cox Cox, and his wife, or several others, managed to survive. They built a large cypress log or a small boat, as instructed by the gods. They loaded it with maize corn and a dog. When the waters finally receded, they landed on a mountain, possibly Mount Colhuacan. They were the sole survivors. To repopulate the earth, they began to have children. But their children were born mute. The gods, seeing this, took pity on them. They gave the children the power of speech, but each spoke a different language. This explained the diversity of languages in the world. The myth also says that some of the other survivors tried to build a great tower, but the gods became angry and destroyed it, scattering the builders and their languages. This echoes the biblical Tower of Babel. The Aztec myths, collected shortly after the Spanish conquest, provide a fascinating insight into their worldview. These scholars, like Miguel Leon Portilla in Aztec Thought and Culture, detail how these cycles of destruction and creation were central to Aztec life and ritual. They understood that their current world, the fifth sun, was also destined to end, possibly by earthquakes. This belief shaped their worldview and their practices, including human sacrifice, which they believed was necessary to appease the sun god and postpone the inevitable end. From a geological perspective, Mesoamerica is a region of high seismic and volcanic activity, and also experiences severe hurricanes and tropical storms. While a 52-year-long flood is unlikely, repeated catastrophic storms and associated river floods could have been common enough to integrate the idea of a great flood into their cyclical worldview. Why do Aztec and other Mesoamerican myths emphasize human muteness as a consequence of the flood? What does the theme of different languages emerging after the flood tell us about ancient perceptions of cultural diversity? And how did the knowledge of past cosmic destructions influence the Aztecs' daily lives and their readiness for the end of their own world? Number 10. What happens when the gods lose their temper? The Maya civilization, known for its advanced calendar and complex religious beliefs, also had stories of creation and destruction, including a flood myth. The most comprehensive source for this is the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya. It was written down in the 16th century, likely by unknown Quiche nobles, preserving oral traditions that go back much further. It describes several attempts by the gods to create humanity, with each attempt ending in failure and destruction. The gods, called the Heart of Sky and the Sovereign Plumed Serpent, first tried to create humans out of mud. But these mud people were weak. They couldn't walk or talk properly. They just melted away. So the gods destroyed them, probably by dissolving them with water. Their second attempt was to make people out of wood. These wooden effigies could talk and multiply, but they had no souls, no minds. They forgot their creators. They were like puppets. The gods were angry at their disrespect. So they unleashed a great flood. It rained incessantly, day and night. The water rose and covered the earth. The wooden people were washed away and destroyed. The few who survived were turned into monkeys, which explains why monkeys look somewhat like humans but are not true people. This is a common motif in many Mesoamerican myths. After the flood, the gods tried again. They eventually succeeded in creating humans out of maize corn, which became the sacred food source for the Maya. These were the true ancestors of humanity. The Popol Vuh, translated by scholars like Dennis Tedlock, reveals a cosmology where creation is not a single event but a process of trial and error, involving destruction and rebirth. This cyclical view is very different from the linear narratives of the Abrahamic traditions. The flood here is less about divine punishment for specific sins and more about the gods correcting their own mistakes in the creative process. Like the Aztecs, the Maya lived in a region prone to natural disasters. Hurricanes, heavy rainfall, and the associated flooding of rivers and low-lying areas in the Yucatan Peninsula were common. The destruction of cities due to environmental factors, including major floods or droughts, is well documented in Maya archaeology. For example, evidence of severe droughts around 800 to 1000 CE is often cited as a contributing factor to the collapse of the classic Maya civilization. But while drought ended that age, the memory of water's destructive power was also strong. This myth would have reminded the Maya of the gods' power and their own dependence on maize for survival. Why do the Maya gods destroy their creations, not just once, but multiple times, each with a different method? What does the transformation of the wooden people into monkeys tell us about Maya beliefs on the continuum of life? And how did the Maya's cyclical view of creation and destruction shape their resilience and ability to rebuild after real-world catastrophes? This is number 9. Can a hero really hold back the waters? The Chinese flood myth is a bit different from many others. It doesn't focus on divine punishment for human wickedness. Instead, it's a story of human ingenuity, perseverance, and heroism in the face of a massive natural disaster. It's often associated with the figures of Gun and Yu, and the establishment of the Shai dynasty, one of China's earliest dynasties around 2070 BCE. These tales are found in ancient texts like the Shujing Classic of History and Shanhaiying Classic of Mountains and Seas, compiled over centuries. According to the myth, during the time of Emperor Yao, a great flood engulfed the land. The waters rose so high they covered mountains and threatened the entire world. It wasn't just rain. Some stories say the rivers overflowed uncontrollably, perhaps due to a supernatural cause. Emperor Yao sought someone to control the flood. He chose Gun, the father of Yu. Gun tried for 9 years to stop the flood. He used a magical self-expanding soil called Shirang. He built dams and dikes with it, trying to contain the rising waters, but his efforts failed. The Xerang didn't work as he hoped, or the gods were against him, or the water simply overpowered his static defenses. Some accounts say he stole the Xerang from the gods, incurring their wrath. He was eventually executed by Emperor Shun Yao's successor on Feather Mountain for his failure. Then, Yu, Gun's son, was appointed to finish the job. Yu had a different approach. Instead of trying to block the water, he decided to work with it. He spent 13 years tirelessly digging canals, dredging riverbeds, and channeling the floodwaters into the sea. He traveled the entire land, often transforming into animals like a bear to do the heavy digging. He worked so hard that his hands and feet became calloused and his body grew deformed. He passed his home 3 times but never went inside, so dedicated was he to his task. Yu's method worked, the waters receded, and the land became arable again. He mapped out the 9 provinces of China and taught people how to cultivate the land. For his incredible service, Yu became a revered hero and was eventually chosen as the first emperor of the Xia dynasty, marking the transition from mythical age to dynastic rule. This flood story is not just a myth of disaster, it's a foundational myth of Chinese statecraft, emphasizing the importance of engineering, centralized authority, and service to the people. Historians and geologists, like the researchers from Peking University, have looked at geological evidence for massive floods on the Yellow River. In 2016, an international team published research in Science proposing evidence for a cataclysmic flood on the Yellow River around 1920 BCE. This flood, possibly caused by an earthquake that created a huge landslide dam, could have been large enough to inspire the Yu the Great story and provided a basis for the founding of the Shai dynasty. It would have been one of the largest freshwater floods known in the last 10,000 years. Why does the Chinese flood myth highlight human ingenuity and hard work over divine intervention, in contrast to so many other cultures? What does the failure of Gun's damming strategy and the success of Yu's channeling approach tell us about ancient Chinese understanding of water management? And could the proposed 1920 BCE Yellow River flood really be the historical anchor for such an enduring and transformative national myth? Number 8. What if the land itself decided to disappear? The Hopi people, Native Americans who live in northeastern Arizona, have a rich spiritual tradition that includes a complex creation story and a flood myth. Their myths often speak of several worlds or ages, each destroyed and created anew. The flood occurs at the end of the Second World. These stories have been passed down orally for generations, and were later recorded by anthropologists like Frank Waters in Book of the Hopi, published in 1963, based on interviews with Hopi elders. In the Hopi tradition, the first world was destroyed by fire, but the second world was ended by ice and water. Humanity had become corrupt and forgot the creator, Taioa, and his assistant, Sotuknang. People became selfish and warlike. They strayed from the spiritual path. Sotuknang, acting on Taioa's instructions, warned the righteous ones. These were people who still lived in harmony with nature and held on to their spiritual values. The righteous people were led to a specific place. Some versions say they were hidden in large ant mounds, symbolizing their connection to the earth and their humility. Other versions suggest they might have traveled in hollow reeds or even a kind of boat, but the emphasis is often on them being preserved rather than building a vehicle. Then Sotognan unleashed the flood. It wasn't just rain, the world was overturned. Ice melted, mountains crumbled, and the ocean surged. The entire landmass sank beneath the waves. The earth itself was reshaped. This great water event purified the world, washing away the wicked and the corrupt. After the destruction, Sotuknang took the righteous survivors across the vast waters on rafts or within hollow reeds. He guided them to a new land which became the Third World. Here, they were meant to live in peace and harmony, remembering the lessons of the previous destructions. The Hopi believe they are now living in the Fourth World, and they carry the knowledge of these past destructions as a warning for their current way of life. The Hopi flood myth is unique because it combines water with ice, suggesting a deep memory of both deluge and glacial melting. The geographical area of the Hopi, the high desert plateau, does not experience floods of this scale. However, the presence of ancient lake beds in the American Southwest and geological evidence of major climate shifts during the last ice age, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, could have shaped such narratives. The melting of vast ice sheets would have caused sea level rise and changes in water systems globally, which could have been perceived as a universal flood. Why do the Hopi traditions link the flood with a preceding ice age and then subsequent fire, creating a unique cycle of destruction? What does the detail of humans hiding in ant mounds tell us about the Hopi's profound connection to the earth and its creatures? And how do these multi-generational myths passed down orally maintain such consistent details over thousands of years? Number 7. How do you build a world without a dry place to stand? The Inca flood myth, like many in the Americas, speaks of multiple creations and destructions. The most prominent version involves Viracocha, the creator god. This myth was recorded by Spanish chroniclers like Garcilaso de la Vega el Inca in his royal commentaries of the Incas 1609, drawing from his mixed Spanish and Inca heritage. He recounted the oral traditions passed down through generations. Before the current world, there was a dark, chaotic time. Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca, or sometimes from the Pacific Ocean. He created a race of giants. But these giants were unruly and disobedient. Viracocha grew angry with them. So he sent a great flood to destroy them. This flood was called Unu Pachacuti, meaning water that overturns the land. The waters rose tremendously, covering the entire earth. All the giants were drowned. Some accounts say that a few people, perhaps chosen by Viracocha, survived by climbing into hollow reeds or floating in small boats. They landed on mountain peaks as the waters receded. One prominent version mentions a man named Manu, not the Hindu Manu, and his family surviving in a small raft. After the flood, Viracocha reappeared from Lake Titicaca and began the process of a new creation. He created the sun, moon, and stars. Then he created a new race of people, smaller and more refined than the giants, from stones and clay. He assigned them to different regions and gave them their languages and customs. This new creation led to the ancestors of the Inca people. The Inca myth, like the Aztec and Maya, emphasizes divine retribution and the cyclical nature of creation and destruction. Viracocha's actions are seen as a cleansing, making way for a better, more ordered world. The emphasis on Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake in the world, as a point of origin and rebirth is significant. It's a sacred place for the Inca. Archaeological and geological research in the Andes region has shown evidence of significant Paleolakes and dramatic climate shifts. For example, studies by researchers like Nathan Craig have highlighted past environmental changes and resource pressures that would have challenged ancient Andean societies. While a single global flood is not supported, the Andean region is prone to severe landslides, glacial lake outburst floods, and El Niño events, which can cause massive rainfall and subsequent devastation. An extreme El Niño could bring prolonged heavy rains, causing widespread flooding across the Andean river systems. Why does Viracocha, the creator god, also act as a destroyer god in the Inca flood myth? What is the significance of Lake Titicaca as both a point of origin and rebirth in this narrative? And could the memory of extraordinary El Niño events, known for their devastating floods in the Andes, have been misinterpreted over millennia as a single, world-ending deluge? Number 6. What if the land itself was once under the sea? Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories passed down orally for tens of thousands of years, contain numerous accounts of floods and the reshaping of the landscape. These aren't single, uniform myths, but rather a collection of narratives from diverse language groups across the continent. They often describe a time when the world was different, when the land was low or entirely covered by water, and how the ancestral beings created the dry land. These stories are a vital part of Aboriginal culture and law, explaining the origin of natural features and cultural practices. One common theme in many Aboriginal flood stories is the rise of the sea level. For example, some stories from coastal groups like the Gunditjmara people of Victoria speak of a time when the sea came in and covered vast tracts of land. These stories describe people trying to escape the rising waters, climbing trees, or moving to higher ground. In some narratives, the flood is caused by a giant serpent or an ancestral being, often as a punishment for disrespecting sacred sites or breaking cultural laws. A specific example from the Yuin people of the New South Wales South Coast tells of a great storm and tsunami that covered the land. The people survived by moving inland to the mountains. When the waters receded, they returned to find a transformed coastline. What makes these stories particularly compelling is their deep antiquity. Australia has been continuously inhabited for at least 65,000 years. During the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were much lower. As the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose by about 120 to 130 meters, dramatically reshaping Australia's coastline and submerging vast areas of coastal plains. This process wasn't instantaneous, but it took place over thousands of years, with episodes of rapid sea level rise. Geologists and archaeologists like Patrick Nunn, a professor of geoscience, have analyzed these Aboriginal flood stories. In his book, The Last Great Tsunami: The Search for a Modern Myth, he details how many of these narratives align remarkably well with scientific data on post-glacial sea level rise. Some stories even accurately describe islands that are now submerged, or coastal features that existed thousands of years ago. This suggests that these oral traditions have preserved accurate geological memories for an astonishingly long time, perhaps for 7,000 to 12,000 years or more, making them some of the oldest continuous narratives in human history. How could oral traditions have preserved geological memory of sea level rise and landscape changes for thousands of years, far beyond what was previously thought possible? What specific environmental cues or natural phenomena allowed for such accurate transmission of ancient coastal geography through storytelling? And what does this reveal about the human capacity for historical memory, even without written records? Number 5. What if the flood was a new beginning, not just an end? The Mbuti people, a pygmy group living in the Ituri forest of the Democratic Republic of Congo, have a rich oral tradition, including a flood myth that is less about divine punishment and more about the chaotic forces of creation and the reordering of the world. These stories were documented by anthropologists like Colin M. Turnbull in The Forest People 1961, capturing their deep connection to the forest environment. In the Mbuti creation story, the world began in darkness. The creator god, sometimes known as Tor, or various other names depending on the specific Mbuti subgroup, brought light to the world. But things were not yet fully formed or orderly. In some versions, there was a time when water covered much of the land. One version tells of a great flood that came during a time of chaos. The Mbuti do not typically frame it as a punishment for human evil, as their culture emphasizes harmony and balance. Instead, it seems to be part of the primordial creation process, a natural disaster that reshaped the world. During this time, the first people or their ancestors survived by climbing tall trees, perhaps the sacred moke trees, which are central to Mbuti's spiritual life. As the waters receded, they revealed the new ordered land of the forest, which became the home for the Mbuti people. The flood helped to define the boundaries of the land and the forest, shaping the environment they would come to inhabit and depend on. The stories sometimes describe how the forest itself grew from the mud and new land left behind by the receding waters. The Mbuti flood myth stands out because it lacks the punitive, moralistic tone common in many other flood narratives. It reflects a worldview where nature is a powerful, sometimes destructive, but ultimately life-giving force. The focus is on adaptation, survival, and the intimate relationship between humanity and the forest. The story connects the Mbuti directly to their environment, explaining why they live as they do and why the forest is so central to their identity. The Congo Basin is an area of immense rivers, including the Congo River, which is the second largest river in the world by discharge volume. Periodic, massive floods of the Congo River and its tributaries are common, especially during heavy, rainy seasons. While not on a global scale, these regional floods can be devastating, reshaping landscapes and displacing communities. Scientists studying the paleoclimate of Central Africa have found evidence of significant hydrological changes over millennia, including periods of increased rainfall and larger lake-river systems, which could easily have given rise to persistent flood narratives among early inhabitants. Why does the Mbuti flood myth emphasize chaos and natural reshaping over divine moral judgment? How does survival by climbing trees, rather than building a boat, reflect a unique adaptation to a dense forest environment? And what can this less moralistic flood story tell us about differing human perspectives on nature's power and intent? Number 4. What if the moon itself caused the waters to rise? Many Native American tribes across North America have flood myths, each with unique details. The Salishan-speaking peoples of the Pacific Northwest, including tribes like the Lumi, Squamish, and Coast Salish, have a particularly vivid flood story that often involves supernatural animals and a very high mountain. These stories have been passed down orally for countless generations and collected by ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries, such as Franz Boas in his extensive works on Native American mythology. One common version tells of a time when the world became disordered. Animals and humans could talk to each other, but they began to misuse their powers. Or sometimes the story attributes the flood to a vengeful spirit, or a general decline in respect for the land and its creatures. The spirit of the moon or the creator decided to cleanse the world. A great flood came, often described as an immense tide that just kept rising, or as the waters breaking forth from underground. The water rose higher and higher, covering the land. The people and animals sought refuge. They fled to the highest mountain peaks. Mount Baker Kulshan, Mount Rainier Tahoma, or other significant local peaks are often named as the refuge spots. The people built canoes or rafts. In some versions, they tied their canoes to the top of a giant cedar tree or used a very long rope to anchor themselves to the mountain peak. As the water rose, they had to keep adding lengths to their anchor rope. Many people and animals perished. After a long time, the waters began to recede. The survivors, both human and animal, came down from the mountains. They found a transformed landscape. They were now in a new world, and the creator or the moon spirit gave them new laws and new languages, separating the animal world from the human world. This myth often explains the origin of various tribal groups and their specific territories. These myths are deeply tied to the geography of the Pacific Northwest, a region of high mountains, deep fjords, and a coastline shaped by dramatic geological events. The area experiences frequent earthquakes and tsunamis due to Aztec events such as the 1700 Cascadia earthquake and tsunami, which caused massive flooding along the coast. Research by scientists like Brian F. Atwater has shown that many tribal stories of floods and changes in the coastline align with geological evidence of these ancient tsunamis and seismic events. The idea of the moon causing tides combined with actual tsunami events could have contributed to the myth of an unstoppable rising water. How much of the Salishan flood myth reflects a collective memory of actual megathrust earthquakes and tsunamis along the Cascadia subduction zone? What does the detail of lengthening ropes to anchor boats to mountain peaks tell us about the ingenuity and desperation of ancient peoples facing such a disaster? And how did the experience of a catastrophic flood lead to the restructuring of social order and the diversification of languages in these cultures? Number 3. What if a trickster god saves humanity by accident? The Polynesian flood myths are incredibly diverse, reflecting the vast spread of Polynesian cultures across the Pacific Ocean. Many island nations, from Hawaii to New Zealand Aotearoa, have stories of great floods or tsunamis that shaped their islands. These stories are often intertwined with creation myths and the exploits of culture heroes like Maui. They were preserved through oral traditions and later recorded by missionaries and ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries. One prominent figure in Polynesian mythology is Maui, a demigod known for his cleverness and trickery. While not all flood myths feature him, some do. In some Hawaiian traditions, for example, the god Kane and Kanaloa, or sometimes the god Rua, were responsible for a great flood. A common theme across many Polynesian islands is a flood caused by the wrath of the gods due to human transgressions, or sometimes a primordial water that simply was. In some Samoan traditions, a family survives a great flood by seeking refuge on a high mountain. They release birds to find dry land, similar to the dove motif in other cultures. In Maori mythology from New Zealand, there's the story of Ruatapu. He was shamed by his father, Wenuku, and in revenge, Ruatapu caused a great flood, called Titaio Ruatapu, the Tide of Ruatapu. He warned his family members who had treated him kindly to prepare. The flood swept away all others. Only those who heeded his warning survived, often by climbing into a gourd or a specially prepared canoe. The flood not only destroyed, but also explained the origins of certain fish and marine life from the drowned bodies. The Polynesian islands are incredibly vulnerable to tsunamis, tropical cyclones, and volcanic eruptions that can cause massive localized flooding. The geological record of the Pacific Rim, particularly the Ring of Fire, is filled with evidence of such events. These studies by researchers like James Goff have examined traditional narratives from various Pacific islands, finding strong correlations between oral histories and geological evidence of past tsunamis and storm surges. The rapid sea level rise during the post-glacial period also dramatically changed the Pacific Islands, submerging many low-lying atolls and reshaping coastlines over thousands of years, which would have been directly observed by early navigators and settlers. The very nature of island life means that a major flood, even a localized tsunami, could feel like a world-ending event. For people living on small islands, the concept of all land being covered by water is not abstract, but a very real threat. These myths reflect a deep understanding of their dynamic environment and the fragile nature of their existence. How did diverse Polynesian cultures, spread across vast oceans, develop such similar flood narratives? What does the recurring motif of a specific named family or culture hero surviving tell us about the importance of lineage and adaptation in island societies? And how much of the mythical flood is a collective memory of the devastating impact of very real tsunamis, storm surges, and long-term sea level changes on vulnerable island communities? Number 2. What if the flood was a sign of divine disappointment, but also a second chance? The Welsh flood myth, known as the Deluge of Llynllion, is recorded in the Triads of the Island of Britain, a collection of medieval Welsh texts that encapsulate much of early Welsh history, legend, and tradition. These triads were compiled over centuries, with some elements likely dating back to the Dark Ages, reflecting a unique Celtic worldview. The story tells of a time when the waters of Llynllion, a mythical lake, began to overflow. There are different reasons given for this. Some versions say the lake was intentionally allowed to overflow due to human wickedness, or others suggest it was caused by a monstrous water creature, the Afonk, that lived in the lake, or perhaps by some supernatural neglect. The flood began slowly, but then the waters swelled and covered the entire island of Britain. All of humanity perished except for 2 people, Dwyfan and Dwyfach. They survived by taking refuge in a mastless boat or an ark. They managed to preserve a pair of every species of animal on board. The boat floated on the immense waters for a long time. Eventually, the waters receded, and Dwyfan and Dwyfach became the progenitors of the new race of people who repopulated Britain. This narrative shares clear parallels with other flood myths, especially the Noah story, suggesting cultural exchange or perhaps a common ancient memory. The Welsh flood myth, while perhaps less detailed than some others, is an important part of Celtic cosmology. It emphasizes the destruction of a corrupt age and the emergence of a new beginning through a chosen few. The specific mention of Llynllion, a lake, suggests a localized memory that was then scaled up to a universal event. From a geological perspective, Britain has a long history of significant flooding events. The low-lying coastal areas and river plains are particularly vulnerable to heavy rainfall, storm surges from the North Sea, and rising sea levels. While a single flood covering all of Britain is not geologically supported, the memory of severe regional river floods or coastal inundations, potentially exacerbated by an early post-glacial sea level rise, could have been incorporated into this mythical narrative. Studies of paleoclimates in Britain indicate periods of dramatic weather patterns and significant hydrological changes over the past several millennia, leading to large-scale flooding events that would have devastated early communities. Why does the Welsh myth locate the source of the flood in a lake, rather than the ocean or sky, as in many other cultures? What does the survival of Dwyfan and Dwyfach, akin to Noah and his family, suggest about shared ancient beliefs across seemingly disparate cultures? And could the myth's scaling of a localized flood to cover an entire island reflect the limited geographical understanding of ancient peoples, making a regional disaster feel like a global one? Under 1, are we just repeating history, or are we destined to repeat our mistakes? The story of the Great Flood is not just an old tale, It's a fundamental part of human experience across cultures and throughout time. We've looked at 15 different versions here, from ancient Mesopotamia to the Pacific Islands, from the Americas to Africa and Europe. Each one is unique, but each one also shares something very deep. They talk about a world ending. They talk about a fresh start, and almost always, they talk about a divine hand in it all. Whether it's an angry god, a wise god, or just the forces of nature personified, something powerful caused the water to rise. And humanity, or at least a few chosen ones, somehow survived. They were given a second chance. The scholars like David Keyes, in Catastrophe and Investigation into the Origins of the Modern World, connect such ancient memories to real environmental disasters like volcanic eruptions or meteor impacts that could have caused climate change and massive floods. The work of Ryan and Pittman on the Black Sea inundation, suggesting a massive flood around 7,500 years ago, also offers a potential Rosetta Stone for some of these myths. This event, if it truly happened as proposed, would have submerged a vast freshwater lake, turning it into a salty sea and displacing countless people. But even with all this research, with all the scientific exploration, something still feels just out of reach. We can find geological evidence of local floods, tsunamis, and rising sea levels. We can trace common story elements, but the sheer universality of the Great Flood myth, the moral lessons, the idea of a chosen few, it still makes you wonder. These myths are more than just historical accounts of ancient disasters. They are stories about human nature, about our capacity for good and evil, about our relationship with the divine or with nature itself. They are stories about resilience, about starting over, and about the deep human need to explain the unexplainable. They are warnings too. Warnings about hubris, about disrespecting the natural world, about forgetting our place. And in a world facing climate change, rising sea levels, and extreme weather events, these ancient stories feel more relevant than ever. They remind us that the power of water to destroy and to cleanse is something humanity has always understood deeply and personally. Maybe we haven't learned enough from those who came before us. If many of these myths have a basis in real geological events, how much of our cultural memory is actually inherited science, passed down as narrative? What does the persistence of the righteous survivor motif tell us about fundamental human anxieties and hopes for divine favor or moral selection? And in a time of accelerating climate change, are these ancient flood myths a forgotten prophecy, or just a testament to humanity's enduring struggle with forces beyond its control?